Okay, before we actually get to sewing the seams, I wanted to give you a few knitting pointers for when you're knitting your panels if you haven't already. First of all, I generally use an E-wrap cast on at the beginning of my panel, and then I'll do a super stretchy bind off at the end. Those work well together and you get a similar tension at both ends of the panel. I have some videos about those which I'll link to in the comments. The other thing I always do is I mentioned earlier a garter stitch border around all four edges. So I've started with 3 rows of garter stitch, and then I have a few stitches of garter stitch at both ends of the rows all the way up the panel, and I ended with a few rows of garter stitch as well before I did my bind off. The other thing that I always do is include edge stitches or turning pegs at the ends of my rows on both ends, and that's a stitch that you slip the stitch at the beginning of the row and you always knit it at the end of the row, even on rows where you're purling for your garter stitch, and that gives you a nice clean edge like this that you can seam very easily. So I have my 2 panels, and now we'll get to sewing the seams. First, let's gather the tools that we need. So along with your panels and the yarn and scissors, you'll need some kind of a yarn needle. I use these with the bent tips. I have them because I use them for my super stretchy bind off, and that's easier to use. You could use a straight tip needle if you have that as well. I also like to use some of these plastic stitch markers, the kind that will slip through the yarn, through the stitch, to help hold the seam together, kind of like safety pins. If you don't have these kind of stitch markers, safety pins would work just as well. Okay, let's set up our first seam. I'm going to start by laying my panels out in that L shape that I showed you with the paper panels earlier. So we have panel 1 with the width across here and the long side going this way, and then panel 2 is going to go the other way. So here's the width and the length, and we're going to sew from here to here. But we want to sew the seam from the inside, so I'm going to flip this one over this way, and I will attach the 2 panels here. So I'm going to turn them sideways, and then this is where I'm going to use my stitch markers to hold the panels together. And I want to try to make sure that I have, because they're stretchy, I want to make sure that I have the right amount, this difference over here. Remember when we talked about to get the right neckline, you don't want this distance to be too long. So I have these measured, and I should have about 12 inches in between there. And it's a little bit long. So I'm going to try to stretch this out a little so that, yeah, now I'm down to about 11, which is probably what I want for my, to have a good neckline for my poncho. So I'm going to take my stitch markers, and I'm going to start with this corner where I want those 2 to come together. I'm going to put a stitch marker through both strands of the stitch on the bottom panel, and then through both strands of that corner stitch on the top panel. Then I'll do the same thing at the other corner. And here I'm finding 2 corner stitches. That's a little bit easier. And again, I always get 2 threads of yarn in the stitch. There's the top one and the bottom one. Sometimes you have to kind of pull to get your 2 threads to go together. go. Now I have my two corners anchored. Now what I'll do is take a few more stitch markers and put them at various places along the seam. I'm going to start in the middle. And the reason I do this, particularly on these ponchos, is you're sewing a length side to a width side. So your stitches are not actually going to be quite the same size because stitches per inch is not the same as rows per inch. So what we'll have to do is anchor it at a few places. And as we go, I'll have to adjust, and I might have to go through the same stitch twice in order to keep the stitches on both panels lined up. So I'll put these in at kind of strategic spots. So now I have 5 stitch markers across there, and that will hold the fabric together in place so I can do the seam. All right, I have cut a piece of yarn that's 4 times the length of my seam, so I have plenty of yarn to work with. I'm going to thread it into my needle. And I'll pull quite a bit of the thread through, probably half or close to it, so that I don't have to be pulling my thread through every stitch for a long time. And I'll start down here at this corner. All right, here's my stitch marker that I've used to hold them together. I'm going to pull the thread through there and just tie a double knot so it'll stay nice and secure. And I'll have a little bit of a tail there. You'll notice also, let me take this stitch marker out now and get it out of the way. I also have the tails from my 2 panels. So I've got those 3 tails, and I think what I'm going to do is cut them off, and I'll just catch those all in my stitches as I do the seam. Then I won't have to weave them in later. It's a little tricky, but I think I can manage it. So as we go, you'll find that as I said, the stitches aren't going to always line up. But to begin with, I can probably go to the next stitch in both panels. So this is the stitch that I went through in the bottom panel, and I'll move on to the next stitch on the top panel as well. So I'm going to put my yarn up through both of those stitches. Again, I always make sure I catch 2 threads, and I'm going to take those tails and lay them over here now so they'll get caught in my stitch. And before I pull it tight, I'm going to take my needle through that loop so that each stitch in my mattress stitch is kind of a little knot that will hold things nice and stable. All right, now I'm going to move those tails out of the way again and find the next stitches to stitch into. Again, I'm going to move to the next stitch on the bottom panel and see where it lines up on the top panel. It looks like I'm going to move to the next stitch there as well. Eventually I'll get to a point where I have to make up a stitch on one panel or the other to keep them in line. Oops. Go through that loop. And then I pull that tight. Okay. Now again, move my tails out of the way. I'll be through those in a few minutes, and then they'll be out of my way. Okay, I'm going to go to the next stitch on the bottom panel. There's my 2 threads, and it looks like it's lining up pretty well with the next stitch on the top panel as well. Put my tails back in, pull through, and go through the loop to make my knot. Right. Already I'm going to pull my thread through the needle a little further so I'm not running into that extra yarn. Okay, let's find our next stitch on the bottom panel, and I think I'm going to make up a stitch. So I'm going to go back into the same stitch on the top panel because that seems to be where it's lined up. next mattress stitch. Okay, we'll just keep going at least until I reach that next stitch marker that's holding things together. Again, next stitch on the bottom and then line it up on the top. Put my tails back in line and complete the stitch. Bottom stitch, top stitch in a row, and I'm kind of checking. I'll hold them together and make sure that this next stitch marker is in line so that nothing's stretching too much. Pull through and do my next stitch. Okay, I think I pretty much got my tails all in there, so they're out of the way now. And you can see that this, once you get a rhythm going, this goes pretty quickly. Sometimes your yarn will get a little bit twisted and you may need to untwist to make things a little bit easier. But I'm going to go at least to this next stitch marker and show you again. So I'm going to keep that in mind. Let's see if I'm going to the next stitch here. Looks like this is the one that lines up on the top panel. Pull that through. And now I've gotten pretty much to where my stitch marker is. So I'm going to catch those all. Pull through. Then I'll get the stitch marker out of the way. And complete this stitch. Yeah, there I'm getting that twisted yarn. Sometimes I have to try different ways to get it to untwist so I can work with it some more. All right, I'm going to continue off camera and get to the end of this seam and show you how to finish the seam. Okay, I've reached the last stitch in this seam. There's where my stitch marker was holding everything together. I'll get my needle through those and get the stitch marker out of the way. I'll do this last stitch. And because we've been doing this mattress stitch that has basically a knot at every stitch, we don't have to be, our last knot doesn't have to be as secure maybe as with some other kinds of stitches. So I'm just going to go through that stitch again the same way and tie another knot. And then we have completed our first seam. Okay, I've opened up the seam that we just sewed so you can see it from the right side. It's right here. And figure out how to do our next seam. So what we've done so far is we've sewn the short side of this panel to the long side of this panel. So now what we need to do is take the short side up here and sew it to this long side here. But we want to make sure again that we have our good difference between the two. So what I'm going to do first is measure out that 11 inches or so. I think it was about 11 and a half on the other one. And I'm going to put a stitch marker right here so I know where I'm shooting for when I put the two sides together. Okay. And now again, because we want to, so this top seam is going to come over to here, and we want to do it right sides together again, so we sew our seam from the back side. So if I find my corner stitch here, which looks like it's there, and I'm going to take this out and I'm going to catch it on that same stitch where it was. So I'm going to put those two together, and then I will put one at the other corner. Again, catch my 2 threads on both panels and try to catch those corner stitches. And I'll put another stitch marker in there. Now I'll check to make sure I've got everything laid out correctly. So if I look at it, and it's going to be inside out now, but you can see where here's the neckline, and this is where we're going to sew the next seam. And you will end up with a poncho shape when we're done. Like that, okay? So this is the seam we have to sew. And I will lay that so I can get at it easily. And I will put more stitch markers in before I start sewing. All right, I've added my stitch markers in here to keep that anchored. And notice, sewing it this time, we've got this kind of bunched up fabric that can get in our way. I almost always do this at a table. If I try to do it in my lap, things just move around too much. So I will sew this seam just like I did the other one. Again, I'll measure out probably 4 times the length of the seam in yarn and cut there. But this seam goes just the way the other one did. You're going to follow the same procedure with that mattress stitch. So I will sew this seam off camera, and then I'll show you what it looks like when it's completed. Okay, and here is the finished product. I finished that other seam. You can see I still have some tails to weave in, but you can see what it looks like when it's all finished. We have a nice sized neckline. And this is a little bit smaller than some of the others that I've made, but it makes a lovely piece, and the lace shows very nicely. So I hope you've enjoyed learning to make a poncho on a loom with 2 rectangular panels. My next video series will be on knitting chart software. So if you have any suggestions for software or features I should look for, please add them to the comments. Also, don't forget to like and share the video and subscribe to my channel to get notified when I post something new.